As the tragedy in Texas comes into full picture tonight, we're taking a step back to put America's school shooting epidemic and possible solutions in a global context.
And by 1997, new legislation was being passed prohibiting the private ownership of higher caliber handguns.
And we hear a plea for action from a father who lost his child in another school shooting.
If we want to start eliminating these things, we need to come together as an American family. We need to start looking for solutions rather than obstacles.
This is In the Loop. I'm Cody LeGros. Let's start here. This is not normal. No other nation in the world suffers mass shootings or school shootings like the United States has again and again. In Newtown, Connecticut, in Parkland, Florida, and now in Uvalde, Texas. 19 children and 2 teachers killed by an 18-year-old with a rifle. This is not normal. And let's look at what we mean by that. The U.S. is a clear outlier when you look at the number of school shootings it's struck with each year. That's true overall, and that's true per capita. The same is true for mass shootings overall when looking at shootings of 4 or more people in one instance. The U.S. has a problem unlike any other nation. The reason behind that depends on who you ask, but a lot of analysis and beliefs on that question come down to 2 factors: mental health and guns. And what's notable there is that the mental health crisis in the U.S., by international standards at least, is actually very much in line with many other countries. The best estimates and data on mental health disorders show the U.S. rate is comparable to much of Europe, parts of South America, and North Africa. Meanwhile, countries with the highest rate of mental health disorders include Australia, a country where mass shootings are rare. So that leaves guns. And when it comes to guns, once again, the U.S. is very much not a normal country. The U.S. has more guns per person than any other nation, and it's not especially close. We have more than twice as many guns per capita as the next country, which is Yemen. Look at it this way. With 393 million firearms owned by civilians in the U.S., there are enough guns to arm every man, woman, and child in America. And then throw in a second gun for another 63 million people. In many parts of the U.S., those guns are easily accessible, even for 18-year-olds, with few or no questions asked. In study after study, researchers have pointed to this proliferation of guns as the key factor behind the high rates of gun violence and mass shootings in America. There are a lot of factors in America's gun violence epidemic. Some of them are complicated. But on this factor, the ease of access to firearms, the data is perfectly clear. This is not normal. Newsy has been on the ground in Uvalde, Texas since the early hours of this story. And right now, we want to take a step back, look at the big picture around this school shooting and how it fits into a pattern in America. We're bringing in Newsy national correspondent Haley Bull, who is in Uvalde. Haley, I know you covered the aftermath of the Parkland school shooting that killed 17 people in Florida in 2018. And as the scale of the tragedy is coming into picture in Texas there, what strikes you as a reporter who saw something similar nearly 4 years ago?
Yeah, Cody. Well, the first is the immeasurable tragedy that really no words can describe. We know this community will be forever changed by this and is so deeply impacted. Now, after school shootings in the past, we've heard calls for change in firearms legislation, a focus on mental health. In the hours following the shooting here in Uvalde, across the country, we heard politicians say, when is it enough? Focusing on that piece of firearms legislation. Here in Texas, we've heard leaders really hone in on the mental health aspect. Governor Abbott highlighting that in a press conference earlier today. Now, in the years following the Parkland shooting, we saw parents form advocacy groups that led to reforms in school security and mental health, and they continue to push for firearms legislation changes. But the details are still coming out about what unfolded here. There is still a lot unknown. In Parkland, we learned more about some of the warning signs and the history there. Governor Abbott said at this point they haven't seen a known history here. The only warnings so far were a series of Facebook posts in the 30 minutes leading up to the shooting. Cody.
So tell us about the people. What are you hearing from the community there, these neighbors who are part of this community and knew the teachers or the students that were killed?
Yeah, Cody, people have come to the school here all day to hand off flowers. They can't get further than this crime scene tape, as police are still actively investigating behind us, and it's a very large scene. But they've handed off the flowers to law enforcement who take it further onto the property, and these have been very emotional moments. We've seen adults, we've seen children, people from as far as Houston come to pay their respects to those lives lost.
So Haley, I covered the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016 in Orlando. So sadly, this is the kind of story we've all gotten used to covering. You meet these people who go through the worst day of their lives. They're forced to endure unspeakable pain, and then we make them process it in a country that is struggling to find a meaningful solution. What might the days, weeks, or months following the shooting look like for this community in Texas?
Cody, based off of other shootings, we know there is an intense focus on the scene that will continue as law enforcement try to piece together what happened, what led to this, and how it happened, as well with more than 20 victims. We know that means there are likely more than 20 funerals ahead in this community. And while there's so much attention right now here in the short term, as we've seen in other communities, there are long-term needs long after all the cameras have cleared out of here, as these communities are, as we said, forever changed and so deeply impacted. Cody.
National correspondent Haley Bull on the ground for us in Texas. Thank you, Haley, and please take care of yourself out there. Newsy will continue its coverage from Uvalde, Texas throughout tonight and over the coming days. But for now, we're turning to perspective from a father who connects with this latest tragedy on a very personal level. Our conversation is next on In the Loop. Welcome back to In the Loop. Whatever your thoughts on what can be done about tragedies like the one in Texas, everyone can agree that far too many families and students have been through this before. Since the shooting at Columbine High School in 1999, over 300,000 U.S. students have been exposed to gun violence at school. We're bringing in Tony Mondalto, the president of Stand with Parkland. In 2018, he lost his daughter Gina to the tragic mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Tony, thank you so much for joining us. And just let's start human to human first. How are you feeling today?
Well, the tragic news out of Texas yesterday, quite frankly, was painful to my family and myself. It brought us right back to the terrible day in 2018 when we learned that our beautiful, forever 14-year-old daughter Gina was murdered at her school. It's a pain no parent can get around.
If you had any, advice to those parents in Texas, what's your message to them tonight?
Well, pretty much the best they can hope for is to breathe, to lean on each other and their family, to lean on their friends and their extended family to let them help, and just try and find a way to make it not to the next day, but the next hour, and go as slow as you need to, and take advantage of all the help you can get.
Can you tell us about the Eagles Act? I was reading a little bit about it before we started this, and where it stands today.
What we have to do is get serious about preventing these things. One way to do that is by following the things that have been laid down by the U.S. Secret Service and National Threat Assessment Center. The Eagles Act is a bipartisan bill in both the House and the Senate, which would provide additional funding to the National Threat Assessment Center so they can continue their research into how to prevent school shootings. Once they complete that research and put out their reports and their findings, they then go out and they train in local communities, different states, different cities. They teach the law enforcement, mental health professionals, and school professionals how to recognize someone who's exhibiting troubling behavior. Again, it's not based on race or anything. It's just based on action and the actions that are shown. So because somebody shows these concerning actions, Then they put them through the behavioral threat assessment. And the behavioral threat assessment is not designed to stigmatize or punish or incarcerate anybody. What it does is it finds out what's troubling the individual and then allows us to connect that individual to services, getting them the help they need long before they resort to violence. And that is the key. So the Eagles Act would allow more funding for research and more funding for training around our nation. It's certainly something that those of us in the middle can support. And that's what we need to see is people in the middle coming together to try and protect our students and our teachers at school.
Reading everything today, I think I saw a headline that said, it's always shocking, but we can't say it's surprising anymore in this country. And when someone says this is unimaginable, what goes through your head? What are you thinking?
Well, to most people, it is unimaginable because this is a very scary subject. And nobody wants to think about the possibility that their child won't come home from school, or when a spouse sends their teacher, a spouse out to work, they don't want to believe that there's a chance they won't come back due to a mass shooting. So it's hard for people to wrap their head around, but we need people to start to understand that if we don't want this to happen, if we want to start eliminating these things, we need to come together as an American family. We need to start looking for solutions rather than obstacles. And sadly, what we've seen from Congress has been looking at obstacles. Let's start with the pragmatic steps, the things we agree on, like red flag laws. Red flag laws, they provide due process. They make sure that people who are a threat to themselves or others do not have firearms. These are something we should all want. Conversely, it makes sure that the people who have firearms that are responsible owners get to keep them. And that's what we want. We don't want this to devolve into a gun debate. That'll never get anything done. We need to look at these pragmatic steps in the middle, the things that can actually be accomplished. Should more things get done on firearms? Great. Should more things get done on mental health? Great. But we feel that the most proactive steps you could have are these behavioral threat assessments encouraged by the Eagles Act and the red flag laws encouraged by S292, getting states to pass these.
While we have you, do you mind telling us about Gina and who she was and how you want all of us to remember her?
My daughter Gina was a great kid. She was our firstborn. She was a Girl Scout, straight A student. She was involved in the color guard team at the school. She loved school. She was a kind and caring individual, often the first one to reach out a hand to a new kid in town and offer them to come play. We raised her to change the world, and hopefully she will. All of the families that have banded together to form Stand With Parkland have similar stories about their loved ones and what great people they were. And I think we banded together so that we can advocate for school safety and honor their memories. Individually for Gina, we have the Gina Rose Montalto Memorial Foundation that is designed to help keep Gina's light shining in this world. We give out scholarships, we make grants to things that Gina would have supported. And that's the best we could do, is support great people who will go out and change the world. We miss our little girl very much each day.
I can see her behind you right there. She's beautiful, and thank you so much for your time.
Now, thanks for reaching out. We appreciate it.
This recent shooting has also reminded many of the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history at Sandy Hook Elementary, where 26 people were killed, 20 of those children. After that tragedy, then President Barack Obama had this to say.
As a country, we have been through this too many times. Whether it's an elementary school in Newton or a shopping mall in Oregon or a temple in Wisconsin or a movie theater in Aurora or a street corner in Chicago, these neighborhoods are our neighborhoods and these children are our children. And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics.
Fast forward to Tuesday night, and here's President Joe Biden's reaction to the shooting in Uvalde.
Why do we keep letting this happen? Where in God's name is our backbone to have the courage to deal with it and stand up to the lobbies? It's time to turn this pain into action.
The two sound eerily similar, and yet they are almost a decade apart. So why has so little changed? And why can't more be done? This year alone, there have already been 27 school shootings in the U.S., and that's just at school. As the U.S. adds yet another one to its list, many eyes are turning to Congress, putting mounting pressure on lawmakers to do something to make the senseless violence stop. According to a Gallup poll from last year, 56% of American adults were dissatisfied with U.S. gun laws and policies. It's worth noting, on the flip side of that, 42% of U.S. adults want to keep U.S. gun laws as is. For years, there have been plenty of proposals to try and strengthen gun laws or strengthen school security. Some of those proposed new laws are written and ready for a vote, but have ended up stalled indefinitely in Congress. We're going to look at a few of those proposals to help stop violence in schools and what the impact could be if they passed and why they haven't been able to make it to law. First up, a proposal on gun buyer background checks known as H.R. 8. A moment from the Warriors head coach Steve Kerr went viral Tuesday night as he brought it up at a post-game conference.
There's 50 senators right now who refuse to vote on H.R. 8, which is a background check rule that the House passed a couple of years ago. It's been sitting there for 2 years.
H.R. 8 would update federal law to include background checks on any and all gun purchases. Current federal law requires that background checks be conducted whenever a person attempts to buy a gun from a licensed gun dealer. According to Everytown for Gun Safety, since 1994, background checks have stopped more than 4 million illegal gun sales to violent criminals and other people prohibited from having guns. And while that has an impact, there are a few loopholes that still let people get their hands on a gun, even if they legally aren't allowed to. Under that current law, background checks are not currently required for sales or transfers by unlicensed and private sellers or at gun shows. H.R. 8 aims to close those existing loopholes. The bill passed the Democratic-controlled House back in 2019, but then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to bring it to the floor. Today, the measure would need to clear the 60-vote filibuster threshold in the evenly divided Senate to actually move forward. Now, the gun lobby may not be the main force in opposition, but they have supported many of the senators holding up gun reforms. 19 current or recent Republican senators, including McConnell, have taken at least $1 million each in campaign contributions from the National Rifle Association over their careers. That's according to data compiled by the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. Another bill aimed at background checks is the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021. It's backed by Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina and passed in the House last year. It would close the, quote, Charleston loophole that allowed a gunman to legally purchase a gun and kill 9 black people at a church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. The loophole lets some licensed gun sales go through before the background check is finished. So if 3 days have passed and the background check is not done, the gun sale can be completed. This proposed legislation would extend the background check review period from 3 to 10 business days.
He should not have had the gun. And the reason he had the gun is because when he went to purchase it, when the 3 days expired as current law allows, they had not been able to verify the information he had given them, and therefore could not complete the background check.
Hours after the shooting at Robb Elementary School in Texas, Senate Democrats placed this bill on the legislative calendar so it can be voted on. We don't know when the Senate will vote on this bill, and as of now, it doesn't seem to have the support it would need to pass. There is another solution that many Republicans support, but it has less to do with gun reform and more to do with school security. After Tuesday's shooting, Texas Senator Ted Cruz suggested that more armed police should be stationed at schools. In an interview with Newsmax, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton said the right response was to ensure more people had access to firearms to stop shootings. Currently, 6 states are pushing to arm teachers. It's an idea President Trump backed when he was in office. But this idea faces opposition, not just in Congress, but among many teachers. According to the National Education Association, putting more guns in schools increases the possibility of a troubled student getting a gun, as well as the likelihood of an accidental shooting. Many states have opted to pass laws prohibiting concealed carry in schools, but at least 10 states allow it, according to current data from the Giffords Law Center. We're going to pause it right here and take a quick break, but this episode is fully dedicated to the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting in Texas. When we come back, we take a look at mass shootings in other countries and how they reacted when such a tragedy occurred. Welcome back to In the Loop. We want to shift away from the U.S. for a minute and take a look at how gun violence and gun laws have been playing out in other countries around the world. One notable example is just across the pond in the UK. The United Kingdom has one of the lowest rates of deaths from gun violence in the world. In 2019, the country had only about 0.04 deaths per 100,000 people. That's compared to 3.96 for the U.S. in the same year. In Britain, knives are the primary weapon used for violence by criminal groups and account for 2 out of every 5 killings. That was also in 2019. By comparison, only 33 people were killed with a gun that year. You see, compared to the U.S., the United Kingdom has one of the strictest sets of gun restrictions in the Western world. Today, the licensing process to obtain a firearm is very rigorous, and the punishment for illegally importing firearms has increased to life imprisonment. Illegal firearms still account for most gun violence in the UK, most of which is related to criminal groups and gang violence. Experts say even a single firearm can be involved in multiple shooting incidents, given the short supply of guns on the street. The UK may not have a similar gun culture or gun lobby as we see here in the US, but there is a strong hunting community there, and there has been pushback to stricter gun laws in the past. In response to the push for tighter gun laws after a mass shooting in the 90s, the late Prince Philip even infamously remarked, "If a cricketer, for instance, suddenly decided to go into a school and batter a lot of people to death with a cricket bat, which he could do very easily, I mean, are you going to ban cricket bats?" But the momentum behind the popular gun restrictions was driven in response to mass shootings and Parliament taking swift action in the aftermath. One momentous school shooting in Dunblane, Scotland had a particularly powerful influence on quelling gun violence in Britain, and like Uvalde, it took place at an elementary school. Joining us from London is our correspondent Ollie Barrett to tell us more about the infamous shooting which brought the UK to where it is today.
It was 26 years ago that a gunman opened fire on a gym class in Dunblane in Scotland, killing 16 school children aged 5 and 6 years old and their teacher before taking his own life. The gunman used handguns which were held legally, and it led to rapid campaigns for tighter gun laws in Britain. Hundreds of thousands of people signed petitions calling for regulations to be tightened, and by 1997 new legislation was being passed prohibiting the private ownership of higher caliber handguns, and those laws were then later strengthened by an incoming new government. There was an amnesty during which the government compensated handgun owners who handed them in. Now, experts would caution against the idea that it's as simple as stricter gun control coming in the UK and that meaning that shootings fall, and they would say that gun crime here is not at all non-existent. Gun ownership is still allowed for some purposes under strict conditions with a license and with police able to conduct background checks. But campaigners in favour of those changes that came in after Dunblane say that there hasn't been a single mass shooting at a school in the UK since. there have only been 2 mass shootings anywhere in the UK since, one in Cumbria in 2010 and one in Plymouth in the west of England last year. Since the Plymouth shooting, in which 5 people died, the current government is strengthening gun laws further so that no one will be given a firearms licence unless police have reviewed information from a registered doctor which sets out whether or not the applicant has relevant medical history, including mental health issues, neurological conditions, or substance abuse problems.
Thanks so much for that, Ali. We're going to take a quick break, but coming up, we're going to head to Japan to see how one nation can tackle the epidemic of gun violence and win. That's up next.
It's time to see the bigger picture, widen the lens, narrow the divide.
We must love and support one another!
That support is shifting, and it's shifting toward concern for climate.
It's about the whole community stepping up to help.
Not everything is left or right, good or bad.
The human capacity for change is so inspiring.
It's time to look closer at the whole story.
A hurricane don't care what your color is or how much money you make. It affects us all.
It's time to ask, why?
The whole goal is to point people to something bigger.
Introducing a new point of view. Yours. Newsy. Watch free 24/7.
Welcome back to In the Loop. In looking for solutions to the gun violence problem in the U.S., we can take some lessons from other countries that have lower rates of gun crimes. The U.S. is on one extreme end of global gun culture, and on the other end is Japan. Statistics show that Japan, which has some of the world's strictest gun control laws, is one of the safest countries when it comes to gun violence. A lot of that comes down to the sheer number of guns allowed to be privately owned in the country. National ownership rates vary compared to the US. Here, there's about 120.5 firearms for every 100 residents. In Japan, it's less than 1 firearm for every 100 people. That's according to data published by the Small Arms Survey in 2018. That same year, while the US recorded nearly 40,000 annual deaths resulting from firearms, Japan recorded 9, according to gunpolicy.org. A large percentage of firearm homicides in Japan are related to the Yakuza crime syndicates, the country's mafia. But even those are rare. Harvard researchers examined 26 developed countries to check whether gun ownership correlated with murder rates. They found a, quote, highly significant positive correlation between the two. So Japan's strict gun laws are a big part of why the country is a safe harbor from gun violence. Now, what exactly does it take to own a gun in Japan? And how do civilians feel about firearms and the related restrictions? Phoebe Amoroso examined those questions.
Deep in the countryside to the east of Tokyo is a rare sight, a gun. Shigeru Kato is hunting for wild boar. He helps the local authorities keep the boar population in check, and he also eats and sells the meat. But getting a firearms permit to do the job was initially more than he bargained for.
You've got to go to the police station and you show up and you say, I want to get a firearm. They take you into an interrogation room. They're going to give you an interview and ask you why. You know, why do you want a firearm? What are you going to do with it? Do you know anyone who has a firearm? And if you clear all their questions and they don't think you're too suspicious, then you start the process. They bring out all the paperwork.
There are background checks, a mental health assessment, chats with neighbors. Then an aspiring owner must pass a written and shooting test. After that, there are yearly checks by authorities. Kato must keep his gun and ammunition separately. He has to log every single location, date, and reason for firing a bullet.
Essentially, the way the law is framed in Japan, gun ownership, it's not a right. It's not like the US where it's written into the Constitution. Here in Japan, it's a privilege to own a firearm. And they can not give it to you for any reason that they decide is a good reason. And they can take it away from you also at any time if they think that you shouldn't have it.
How did Japan arrive at such strict laws? The country famously renounced conflict after the Second World War, inscribing peace into its constitution. But some researchers argue that to understand the present, we need to look further back in Japan's past.
Right back in the Edo period, which was 1603 to 1868, it was forbidden for ordinary people to carry guns and swords. Instead, it was expected that the government would provide appropriate protection for the citizens.
Owning a gun is almost a social taboo in Japan. Outside of sport shooting, hunting, and control of wild animals, there's no reason to own one as a private citizen.
In 2020, there were just 17 shootings, resulting in 4 deaths. Most of these incidents involved organized crime members, in other words, the Yakuza. But their numbers are falling, a combination of an aging population and police crackdowns, and so gun crime is expected to fall even further.
Japan's police do carry guns, but they rarely fire a shot.
Police use batons when the opponent has a weapon. If that is not enough, they will use a longer stick or even a 2-pronged pole. They use the weapon that is appropriate for the situation. More to the point, policemen will use the strength they have as a group, rather than handling it one-on-one. To arrest someone without hurting them, you have to act as a group. So the connection between the police officers is also important.
All police officers must learn judo, kendo, or taiho jutsu, a self-defense specially developed by the Japanese police. But martial arts might be more about mindset than muscle.
Kendo is important because it gives you mental strength and courage. It also trains your ability to judge a situation. That's why Japanese policemen train in kendo or judo.
Reported crime in Japan has fallen for the past 2 decades to its lowest since the end of World War II, and there's generally a sense of safety on the streets. As for guns, they remain for the few who are dedicated enough to their hobby or profession, and who are willing to try to earn the privilege. Phoebe Amoroso for Newsy, Tokyo.
Thanks, Phoebe. Up next, we're going to look into those efforts to help those affected by Tuesday's shooting in Texas. That's right after this break.
Why do we have bureaus in Missoula, Nashville, and Tulsa? Because we want to tell the whole story.
When you look at it from your child's perspective, they don't see the world the way we do anymore.
And elevate voices from all over the country.
There are times when you're just trying to keep your head above the water.
We believe that people are at the heart of a good news story.
So you've lived in this area all your life?
All my life.
We're in the midst of an amazing revolution.
It's probably going to be the biggest challenge of all.
It's through their eyes that we gain perspective and better understand how news impacts them.
Technology is changing, but you can't kill love.
It's about the whole community stepping up to help.
And how it affects you. Newsy. Watch free 24/7.
Welcome back to In the Loop. Before Tuesday, Uvalde was just another small Texas town. The roughly 15,000 people who call Uvalde home are now doing everything they can to help the families in their community affected by the shooting. One restaurant in town has volunteered to help, donating food to feed victims' families and giving free meals for the memorial services of the children who died. National correspondent Thomas Hapa is on the ground in Uvalde and has more on how the community is banding together in the face of tragedy.
It hasn't just hit yet. You know, it's one of those things that's like it's still a shock.
It hurt me a lot. When we heard it yesterday, it really hurt me a lot. There's family that we know and friends, and it's very painful.
What's needed most today is strength, love, and unity.
I did have a friend whose little sister passed, my aunt's cousin's kid also.
After a tragedy struck this small town.
I have friends, I have children at that school, my family have children, so it's just very painful to find out that some of our family is gone, but they're up in heaven. So
one way this community is finding comfort is right here at Sunrise Restaurant. ran by Rosemary Flores for decades.
I'm a very loving, giving person.
Here, Rosemary and her son AJ are cooking meals
May I please have your credit card number again, ma'am?
to donate to families of the victims and those in law enforcement.
The community needs to be together and have sympathy for everyone. And to me, like, I like to help. I like to help people.
She's been taking donations on the phone from all over the world.
How much would you like to donate, ma'am? People are calling from Idaho, Ohio, Wisconsin, even Canada.
All of this work, she says, is so important because in this small town, this is how they stay strong.
For the most part, the whole town's like a family. Everybody knows each other at some point. You know, everybody has a connection somewhere, so.
You know, you need my help, and I'm willing to do whatever I can, you know? And I don't respect anything in return.
This is her first donation trip, one of many she expects to do this week.
It doesn't take a lot, you know, it doesn't take money to fix everything. It doesn't, you know, food can only do so much, but just, you know, being there, being someone nice, is a kind spirit, I mean, does a lot.
And she'll continue to do this for love and unity to keep Uvalde strong.
Do it tomorrow, you know, just until whenever we need to stop, we'll stop. But right now, we need to be together with everybody.
In Uvalde, Texas, I'm Thomas Hopper reporting.
Thomas, thank you for that update. We also want to take a moment here to remember the victims of this shooting in Texas. Newsy's Meg Hilling tells us more about them.
Uzziah Garcia, Eva Mirales, Amarie Jo Garza. These are just a few of the 21 people who won't be coming home to their families following Tuesday's school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. These children and teachers had gathered for another day of learning at Robb Elementary School, just a week shy of summer vacation when shots rang out. As their families grapple with the loss of their loved ones, we're learning more about some of these victims, whose ages range from as young as 8 years old to 46. Uzziah Garcia's grandfather says 8-year-old Uzziah loved to throw the football with him and had a knack for remembering plays. Javier Lopez's mother, Felicia Martinez, told the Washington Post her 10-year-old had just made honor roll. Family members have created a GoFundMe page to help with his funeral expenses. Eva Mirales was a 4th grade teacher who had spent the last 17 years working in education. Her family says she was an avid runner and was always up for an adventure. On Facebook, Stephen Garcia confirmed the loss of his daughter, 10-year-old Eliana Eli Garcia, writing she was a doll and the happiest ever. He says he planned to DJ for her at an upcoming party. For the relatives of those killed, the pain will last a lifetime.
The parents who will never see their child again, never have them jump in bed and cuddle with them. Parents will never be the same. To lose a child is like having a piece of your soul ripped away.
Meg Hilling, Newsy.
Thank you for that, Meg. Another impact of the Uvalde school shooting is the emotional toll this violence will have, both for people directly and indirectly connected to the shooting. Newsy's Lindsay Thies talks to experts who can shed some light on the psychological fallout.
With the nightmare in Uvalde, Texas, trauma takes root.
I see this in the news somewhere else, but not here, but it is happening here.
Mental health experts say trauma comes with a ripple effect, from families grieving their loss of life to many elsewhere grieving their loss of safety.
You may not see these things sort of immediately after these crises, but in the long term, you know, some of these symptoms may sort of show up more.
Sometimes when we have traumatic grief, it's very hard to get to our grieving and mourning because the trauma is so intense. We can have more risk for complicated bereavement or prolonged grief disorder when these things happen.
There's the psychological concept called the hierarchy of needs. The gist is that you have to start with your basic needs and work your way up to grow and be emotionally healthy as a human. This is for everyone, kids, adults, everyone. At the bottom, you have something like sleep, breathing, food, water. Just right above that is safety.
We have this idea that when I go out, I come home. So that presumption of safety, right? And our worldview. When I put my child on the bus, at the end of the day, I need to make sure I'm home to meet the bus. And this has totally rocked that.
For children, feeling unsafe can show up many ways: not eating, a change in sleeping patterns, trouble focusing. But in addition to noticing the child's behavior, adults should be looking at how they're reacting too. Something as simple as taking a news break can make all the difference.
You are modeling for your child how to deal with some of these stressors. And we know like continued exposure to these events through media can also lead to increases in trauma reactions or trauma responses.
Whether it's witnessing that devastation up close or at a distance, experts say caring for each other's mental health and talking about what is keeping you safe is a crucial tool right now. Lindsay Thies, Newsy.
Lindsay, thank you so much. Up next, we'll circle back to our top story on why gun violence and tragedies like the one we saw in Uvalde on Tuesday are so common in America, but so much less so abroad. Back with more in a moment.
What if the news was different and covered more than one side of the story?
Justice wasn't served.
So you can make up your own mind.
I love this so much.
Introducing the new point of view. Yours. Newsy. Watch free 24-hour news.
Welcome back to In the Loop. We've covered a lot of ground in this episode as it relates to gun control, both here in the U.S. and abroad, looking at what's different, what has worked for some, and where there might be room for change. Before we wrap, we wanted to loop back to our first deep dive of the evening. Why does this keep happening here in the U.S.? Let's start here. This is not normal in Newtown, Connecticut, in Parkland, Florida, and now in Uvalde, Texas. 19 children and 2 teachers killed by an 18-year-old with a rifle. This is not normal. And let's look at what we mean by that. The U.S. is a clear outlier when you look at the number of school shootings it's struck with each year. That's true overall, and that's true per capita. The same is true for mass shootings overall when looking at shootings of 4 or more people in one instance. The U.S. has a problem unlike any other nation. The reason behind that depends on who you ask, but a lot of analysis and beliefs on that question come down to 2 factors: mental health and guns. The best estimates and data on mental health disorders show the U.S. rate is comparable to much of Europe, parts of South America, and North Africa. Meanwhile, countries with the highest rate of mental health disorders include Australia, a country where mass shootings are rare. So that leaves guns. And when it comes to guns, once again, the U.S. is very much not a normal country. The U.S. has more guns per person than any other nation, and it's not especially close. We have more than twice as many guns per capita as the next country, which is Yemen. Look at it this way. With 393 million firearms owned by civilians in the U.S., there are enough guns to arm every man, woman, and child in America. And then throw in a second gun for another 63 million people. In study after study, researchers have pointed to this proliferation of guns as the key factor behind the high rates of gun violence and mass shootings in America. There are a lot of factors in America's gun violence epidemic. Some of them are complicated. But on this factor, the ease of access to firearms, the data is perfectly clear. This is not normal. That does it for this episode of In the Loop. Thank you for sticking with us. It was a heavier show than normal, but a very important topic that's deeply impacting our country right now. We're back every night at 9 Eastern with all new deep dives, so be sure to check them out.